Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation, the interview series about topics related to health of the gut, the brain, and the environment. Today, I have the great pleasure to talk to two researchers from the Irving Barber School of Arts and Sciences of UBC, the Okanagan campus of the University of British Columbia. Dr. Gibson and Dr. Gosh are a husband and wife research team who share some of the same research interests related to the topic of dietary fat, even though they pursue this in different settings and disease areas. Gibson is an associate professor at the Department of Biology and Microbiology and the head of the Center for Microbiome and Inflammatory Research. Amongst other topics, Dr. Gibson is interested in the role of gut microbiome interactions in infants and in the role of dietary fat on gut health and gut microbial health. So you share this interest with your husband in dietary fats, but you're more focused on the gastrointestinal tract and the gut microbiome. Right. And can you just expand? So what is your main area of research interest in that space?
So my main interest really is understanding the development of the gut microbes. Where do we get them from? Why do we get them? And how are they influenced? And what does that actually mean for gut health? And mostly I focus on immunity. So diet is a piece of that puzzle because it's an environmental factor that probably I would say comfortably is the major driver in what microbes we get. Starting from what mom ate. So maternal diet has an influence on what type of microbes she's going to pass over to the baby. And then it becomes a generational thing. Whatever baby is being exposed to, diet is still one of the major predictors for what microbes are going to stay in the gut. And so I think it's just one of those really big environmental factors that decides sort of what microbes one is going to harbor and what that might actually mean for gut immunity. And I'm sort of underneath the belief that gut immune responses can drive all sorts of things, good or bad, throughout the entire body.
Yeah, coming back, so I had a couple of specific questions that would love to get your opinion on. So one is that the diet, there's evidence now that the diet of pregnant mothers has an effect on the gut microbiome composition. But also in some mouse studies on brain development, on early brain development. What, in your opinion, is the channel of transmission? Is that through the gut microbial composition and metabolome in the mother that's influenced by the maternal diet, and then during delivery is transmitted or inoculates the baby's GI tract? Is that the main mechanism, or can you think about other ways of transmission of maternal diet to gut health of the infant?
Yeah, so nobody really knows the true answer to that, but it's probably in part, at least in part, the microbiome transmission. It also could be epigenetic changes, so changes that would influence the epigenome instead of the microbiome. It's probably both. Certainly there's solid evidence to support that the microbiome, so maternal diet or maternal influences do change the infant microbiome. And we've shown in our lab, although we haven't published it yet, that can actually persist throughout time. So those changes, they might be minor, different taxa that are changed, they're persistent despite removing that environment, whether that be diet or toxins or what have you. And then that taxa will stay with that particular offspring, which then has the opportunity to pass on to the next offspring. Mm-hmm. So I think there's enough evidence to support that that is in fact at least partially playing a role. Mm-hmm. I don't think we can rule out epigenetic changes, however, at this point in time.
I mean, following up on the earlier conversation I had with your husband about how important the nutrition, for example, of an animal like the cow is on the composition, the fatty acid composition of the milk and the butter, ultimately. So, as you know, one important factor in programming the early gut microbiome in the infant are these human milk oligosaccharides. And I've actually asked several people that question, never really got a definitive answer on that. To what degree does the diet of the mother affect the composition of these complex molecules, the human milk oligosaccharides, which then play a very important role in determining what microbial composition the infant has. Has that been looked at all?
We actually have a paper that's not published yet, but it's in submission, where we actually do show, and we do this in humans. So we've got over 100 mom and baby pairs, and we've looked at maternal diet, and yes, there is an effect. The issue is that studying oligosaccharides or human milk oligosaccharides is incredibly complex. So we've paired up with a chemist, Dr. Wesley Zamberg at UBC, and you have to have very specific methods which aren't common. And so he's discovered a whole new panel of human milk oligosaccharides. So it's far more complex than we even know right now. But certainly we show that diet, maternal diet, does influence the type of human milk oligosaccharides that then influence infant microbes.
Yeah, this is definitely something that I think few people think about. I mean, there's probably also genetics that plays a role, so that women.
There's no doubt. There's evidence to show that that genetics play a role in that as well. Yeah.
So, to what degree do you think that these early life? So people always talk about the first 1,000 days being sort of the main determinant, and I like to compare this to saying that the operating system is basically established, and then later on you can use different softwares, but something fundamentally has been programmed that stays throughout life. How important do you think that is currently? And let me bring up another example. So the Yanomami Indians, that pivotal study several years ago that compared the gut microbial abundance, richness, and diversity between Yanomami people, including their infants, with parents and infants in North American cities, and found that there was a dramatic decrease in the diversity and abundance in North America. Most interestingly, already seen in the infants. So it's not something that the offspring develops because they're eating a different diet once they're born. It's something that seems to be programmed early on in life. Would that fall into the same discussion that we had about the diet of the mother? I mean, obviously they live a very different lifestyle, being exposed to all kinds of environmental organisms, and but I mean, this is something of grave concern. If you think that in Western cities we come into life already with 40% of the potential microbial composition no longer being there, and possibly being extinct, even not coming back.
It's not something that really anyone has solid evidence to say yes or no. Some of my thoughts are, certainly we know that maternal diet does influence the microbes in the infant, and so therefore there's the potential that all of us in North America have really low diversity, and that's just never going to come back. There is that potential, and there's evidence to support that. On the other hand, we've actually done a global study of all available infant microbiome data. And what we can say that even despite genetics as well as influences from the environment, geography, despite that, all infants actually have a very similar succession pattern of the type of microbes in the gut. And so what we find actually drives, and that's really early on. So I'm talking about really the first 30 days of life. And really what drives the separation of microbes turns out to be human behaviors like dietary influences, of course, whether mom's breastfeeding, what mom is eating if she's breastfeeding, whether baby's formula fed, whether baby was C-sectioned or not. So these are really cultural, behaviors as opposed to let's say genetics or the environment. I would say that those are players, but they're more minor players. And so my point is that not all hope is lost. I think that diet is really a key factor. And because that's a behavior, it is a choice. We have some influence, and it just takes, behavior changes, which is not easy, by the way. That's a whole other set of studies, right? How do you change human behavior? But I don't think all hope is lost, is my point. Just because now we, all born in North America and our food systems are sort of messed up, that we're all, we are sick. But I think that still can be changed, because microbes can be changed through the influence of diet.
One strong interest that you have is gut health in the adult as well, and this whole area of inflammatory changes within the gut, like inflammatory bowel diseases. So these are diseases that have increased in prevalence, not just in North America, but now also in developing countries, so just with some delay. Do you think the hygiene hypothesis is the main explanation for that, or are there other factors?
I always have thought about the hygiene hypothesis throughout my entire career. I had the opportunity to visit India last year for my sabbatical, and I started to question the hygiene hypothesis, because the hygiene is not, it's not hygienic in India. No matter where you live, really, and whether you're in the city or whether you're not in the city. And I can tell you that the disease profiles are changing rampantly. So in cities where they really change their foods to sort of look like a Western diet, those diseases are on the rise, like inflammatory bowel disease. But still, there's cholera in their water, no matter what. So their water systems are not clean. So they're still very unhygienic from that perspective, but their disease profiles are changing. So I started to question the hygiene hypothesis myself, and I often wonder why it hasn't been proven. We've had this hypothesis for a very long time, and really all we have is epigenetic studies, or epidemiological studies, sorry, not epigenetic, but epidemiological studies. And we really need to have some other evidence to support whether, if you have this constant stimulation throughout infancy, does that protect you or not from different disease profiles? So I think, we need to do more experiments in that area to really support or to refute that. But based on my experiences and what's going on in say, India, I'm not sure that explains everything.
So you would think that the dietary changes are at least as important, the westernization of diet and the introduction of more processed food.
Honestly, I think it might be the most important thing.
Might be the most important thing.
Yeah.
And you would have, as we talked about earlier, this triple influence: diet of the mother, effect on breast milk, effect on maternal microbes. So multiple channels by which the different dietary habits could affect that.
Absolutely.
In terms of dietary recommendations, so there's, to my surprise, so I'm on been on a commission by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation that has looked at environmental triggers for inflammatory bowel disease. And for me, one of the most important, interesting things was really that so diet and stress have been identified as the two factors in the so-called exposome that have never really been studied in detail. It's kind of amazing because when you see these patients in the clinic, almost everybody tells you about the role of stress in triggering flares, and also, has a lot of questions about the diet. So this has taken a long time before this has actually been accepted now as an equally important to the genetics, where we have made tremendous progress. But these environmental factors, and what's your view on this, having done studies in the area of inflammatory bowel disease in terms of diet? So we don't have a gold standard, it seems like, at the moment.
No, there are no North American Dietary Recommendations for IBD. This is one of the reasons why, over a decade ago when I was studying at Children's and Women's Hospital in pediatric gastroenterology, it was wild to me that nobody understood the influence of diet, because of course it's the first thing that any patient is going to ask. That's exactly why I started to study diet, because my husband, as you know, he's been a lipid biochemist for a long time. And so it just seemed like a natural place to start, because he wasn't looking at the intestines when he was feeding his animals. And so it made sense that we should really understand what was going on in the gut. That's actually how I started to look at diet in the very first place, because my training was in microbiology and immunology. But I think diet could have quite a big influence as well on stress. Our ability to tolerate stress in various ways can be influenced, of course, by probably, the biochemistry of what's happening in our bodies, including in our minds. And that, in my mind, is definitely influenced by diet. So these things may be connected. But in my view, because we don't have dietary recommendations, we are actually doing an intervention trial. And we're doing it with the Mediterranean diet, or something that looks very similar to the Mediterranean diet, very focused on lipids. But of course, fibers are important in that puzzle as well. And we don't have the results yet. But I think that, based on our animal studies, I hope that we'll have some recommendations to make, right? Whether it works or not, at least we'll have some recommendations to make. But there are all sorts of diets. Of course, if you Google it, you'll find all sorts of dietary recommendations for IBD. But the fact of the matter is there's not a lot of evidence to support any of them.
Yeah, because they've never been really funded large-scale studies, which are now, finally beginning. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see that.
Yeah.
So there's an entity, since you're working in the area of gut inflammation, so this concept of metabolic toxemia or low-grade immune activation in the gut, this is almost has become like a household concept now. It's like you talk to people and everybody said, oh yeah, it's all inflammation. And how much do you think that general concept of, if you're on an unhealthy diet, and it's not really known if it's the high fat or the high carbs or the low fiber, or maybe a combination, most likely of the three, which leads, as you know, to the decrease in mucus thickness and increased permeability, and then increased immune activation at the gut and then systemically. Do you think this, this sounds like a very attractive concept to explain many chronic diseases. Do you think that is a valid idea, that there's one big common denominator that has to do with low-grade gut inflammation?
I think that it certainly makes a lot of sense. I think that it definitely fits with a lot of the evidence that's available. So I think it's a good theory as well. The only issue that I have with it is that most of it is still in rodent models, and that's not being translated into humans. And I think that that's really an important step, just to solidify that sort of theory. There's all sorts of wild, things that you can find online about how to, cure your so-called leaky gut. Well, I don't think there's a lot of evidence to say that we can translate a lot of this into humans. And, I sort of take issue with the term leaky gut, because at some point in development, we all have increased permeability, and there's a reason for that. Same with inflammation. I don't look at inflammation as always being bad. So we need inflammation actually to survive. And so some inflammation is protective and some inflammation is damaging. And so generalizing too much, I think is problematic. But, we just actually wrote a review on the so-called leaky gut for the Dietitians of Canada, just sort of refuting that sort of terminology. And there's very little evidence actually to support the role of diet within that, surprisingly. Very little evidence, despite the fact that all over the place, people are talking about how to cure your leaky gut with diet. So I think we have to, there's evidence for that theory that chronic low-lying inflammation in the gut is definitely promoting this sort of metabolic toxemia, and that can create problems all over the body systemically. I think that there is evidence for that, but we need to be very careful that we don't sort of, make generalizations for everything, and certainly have the evidence to support that before we start writing books on, say, what diets cure leaky gut, which there are quite a few, but there's no evidence to support that.
In terms of, so you're also involved in development of therapies that are either using microbes or targeted microbes. What, without sort of talking about any details of this, but what do you think are the most exciting area in this field of harnessing the microbiome science for novel treatments?
I think it's really a really exciting area. One of the major reasons in my mind is because when we're thinking about, say, IBD, the dominating, of course, immunomodulation. And so we take something that blocks a particular cytokine, and we sort of, get rid of the damaging effects of that cytokine. That's one avenue, right? But I think that IBD is a very complex disease. Not everybody might have that cytokine as the dominating thing that's causing damage. So when I think about microbiome-based therapeutics, what really excites me is that it's far more complex. So even taking one microbe, there's 10 or 20 different pathways of which that microbe has the potential to stimulate a protective immune response. And so it's a much more complex therapy that might make more sense for certain diseases like inflammatory bowel disease. So that's sort of the biggest thing that comes to my mind.
Okay, yeah, so I think, I sometimes get invited to these meetings where you have these tripartite meetings. You have researchers, you have investors, and you have startup company representatives. And the current model, I think, is still dominated by the pharmaceutical model, that you want to identify this one microbe that ideally you're going to manipulate genetically, and then it's going to, which I think is very, very limited. I mean, it goes against the whole concept of ecology. That's
right.
And I don't know how long it will take. I mean, there's millions and millions of dollars being invested in these kind of approaches.
Yeah.
Maybe it will take a first wave of disappointment before people are actually reconsidering, that we have to approach this in a different way. Yeah,
well, I think, if you're taking the drug approach where you're going to isolate that one molecule from that one microbe, I think that's probably is going to be leading to disappointment. Now, on the other hand, if you look at fecal transplantation, it's been a bit disappointing too for, say, IBD. Fantastic for C. diff. But for IBD, it's been a bit disappointing as well. And that's because we really need to understand what's in there. You got to find these super donors, and that's really challenging. And there's all sorts of problems associated with that. So maybe it's a combination of 1 or 2 or 10 microbes. That's still far more complex than a single molecule being secreted from a microbe. And so I think, all sorts of approaches are being taken right now. It's a really exciting space. But if we don't investigate it, we'll never know. And so I hopefully, not too much disappointment, but with all things in science and research, there's about 90% disappointment and 10% success. So, right?
Well, given that, that realistic assessment, what would you say is a likely scenario for you or in the microbiome field in general, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now? Are we gonna be able to treat, cure, prevent Parkinson's disease? Are we gonna be able to treat IBD? Do you think any of these things is realistic in the next 5 years, or do you think
no? No. In 5 years, definitely not. I'd be very skeptical if anything came out on the market. The thing about, say, probiotics, right? we know how to grow a handful of microbes and we market them for every single disease, but that's not realistic either.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it might be dangerous. I think every microbe has the potential to influence a particular disease, and we need to understand the microbes around that. We need to know how to grow the right ones and which ones treat the right diseases in adults versus, infants. It's all going to be different. It's not a one size fits all. So 5 years is totally unrealistic. I think that you have to take the traditional pharmaceutical route because that's where you get the evidence. So, for me, we are developing microbiome-based therapeutics, and I could go the natural product route, and I probably have them in the market now, but I'm not, because I think that's it's not ethical, actually. We need to understand what these things do, and we need to know what they're doing them for, and therefore they need to be studied first. And so I look at this more of like a 10-15 year sort of very traditional pharmaceutical pipeline, because that's when you get the evidence and the safety. And I think that, for example, right, we did a study where we looked at probiotic supplementation in infants, and it was surprising to me that moms, because this was a prospective cohort study, so it was surprising to me that moms would choose to actually give probiotics in such high abundance to their infants and not really have any evidence to support whether this would be good or bad. And in the end, what we found, and when we followed up in toddlers, was the ones that were supplemented in the first 6 months of their life actually had more susceptibility to getting sick with mucosal illnesses, diarrhea and respiratory. So I think we have to be careful, is my point.
That goes along with that recent study by Alanoff and colleagues.
That's right.
Israel, that there was actually a delay in the recovery of a normal gut microbiome after antibiotics if you were on a probiotic. Yeah.
And that makes sense because our ecology is so complex. Why would you supplement it with one type of microbe?
Yeah. In
such high abundance? I mean, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, the results that they found, to me anyway. Lactobacillus, okay, well, we know how to grow that one, and therefore we put that in, all sorts of foods and we sell it as a probiotic. But in reality, like, how much lactobacillus do you have in your gut? It's like less than 5%, right? So why are you giving 1 million dose every single day? It does make sense to me what they showed. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you one last question based on your, in-depth knowledge and your husband's knowledge and in sort of another dietary related field. What kind of, do you pay attention to what you eat, and what kind of diet do you actually follow yourself based on the science?
Yeah, so my husband eats a very traditional Indian diet. And so therefore we do as well. And mostly that means that we cook with ghee or butter. We eat a ton of olive oil because of the studies that we've looked at. We try to eat very, very little omega-6. So we don't have a lot of canola oil. We don't cook with that. We'll use olive oil that's not cooked, so fresh olive oil on salads or what have you, and then we cook with more saturated fats. I'm really impressed with the research on the fiber. So we try to eat really high fiber foods, especially for my kids. Whether it tastes good or not is irrelevant, but you can make it taste good too. And we really don't buy anything processed. Like nothing. We don't have cereal. My kids aren't allowed to eat cereal. I have weaned them off of bread. Bread is something that I grew up with, but honestly, it's not something that I feel like is healthy to eat. So we avoid really all boxed foods and anything processed. The biggest thing for my family is we really love food. So we all have, we love food too much. And I think that calorie reduction is a really important piece of that puzzle. And so I think probably we all eat way too many calories. A a normal person should be eating 2,000 calories. I'm not sure that that's right. Perhaps you only need 1,200 calories in a day. That's sort of something that I'm still thinking and exploring, but certainly the calorie reduction and prolonging life expectancy, that sort of evidence seems to be pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
We don't avoid meat, but we do eat a lot of lentils. So we eat probably meat only once or twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
And we eat the other days a lot of dal and vegetarian type foods.
Well, thank you very much. This was really informative, both in terms of the science and also, you know, in terms of the practical recommendations. I think it's, to me, it sounds like a very prudent way of eating that we are pursuing as well, very, very similar. And yeah, I mean, I hope there will be opportunities in the future to interact with you guys. Sounds like very exciting research.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.